Good morning, and welcome back to MWise 22. We have a great lineup for you today, starting with our Threat Intelligence panel. In early January 2020, in response to the targeted drone strike killing of Qasem Soleimani, Mandiant intelligence observed Iranian password spraying of critical infrastructure across the United States and Europe. The risk of retaliatory action from Iran represented a real threat to organizations around the world. In these times, one of our first calls went to our friends at CrowdStrike to ensure that they were seeing what we were seeing, and they were. We were able to share information between us to ensure that we defended against this new threat. This was not the first, and certainly not the last time that members of this special community put aside competition to defend their customers. The cyber threat intelligence community are competitors for sure, but when the time comes, it's one team and one fight. The Threat Intelligence panel today represents some of the best and brightest in the threat intelligence community, and our goal is to make this a standing panel at MWise. To moderate our panel and introduce our speakers, we're honored to have Chris Bing, the cybersecurity reporter for Reuters, and Chris has actually done some incredible threat intelligence work himself, particularly on mercenary threat actors carrying out all sorts of global mischief. And he is also doing, in his spare time, a master's degree at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So, ladies and gentlemen, Chris Bing.
Good morning. My name is Christopher Bing. I'm an investigative reporter with Reuters focused on cybersecurity. I'm really glad to be here today. The Mandiant's Washington conference was actually my first cybersecurity conference as a reporter 9 years ago. So a little older, a little grayer hair, but happy to be here. We have a great panel today of some of the leading cyber threat intelligence analysts in the world. And we have a great conversation started. It comes at a really important time amid the current conflict with Russia and Ukraine, an increasingly aggressive Iran, an election coming up, and of course, a growing threat in terms of ransomware. So please welcome our panel today. Thank you. So to get started, I'm sure these faces look familiar, but we're just going to start with little introductions, starting with Katie on the left.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here with you this morning. My name is Katie Nichols, and I'm the Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. We do managed detection response. We track all of the threat actors trying to make the community safer. When I'm not doing Red Canary things, I also teach for the SANS Institute. I'm a certified instructor for their cyber threat intel class. And when I'm not doing that, I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, their Cyber Statecraft Initiative. So it's a little bit about me. Really happy to be here today.
Hi, Adam Meyers. I run the Intel program at CrowdStrike and have been working with John certainly since back to the early days of the 2000s at the State Department. But that's me.
I'm John Hultquist. I'm from the Mandiant's intelligence team. Been doing this for a while. I'm also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins, where Chris has just joined the fray.
John does not grade my papers. I'd be afraid if he did. So top of mind, obviously, Ukraine crisis. Seems like every day we have a large headline that comes out, whether it's a nuclear threat or cyber attack, and it's an ongoing event. It's very dynamic. On the cyber front, we've seen a flurry of activity from destructive malware to an incident that affected satellite communications, and it's ongoing. We're only seeing a small piece of it. John, can you give us a little bit of an overview of what's been going on there?
Sure. I think it's a question of like what we've seen, what we expect, what people think is missing here in the conflict. So, the cyber portion of the conflict began long before the actual invasion. Especially in terms of intelligence collection, we've seen a host of different players sort of carry out a ton of intelligence collection in Ukraine from players like the one that I think is best known as Armageddon. These guys are Ukrainian intelligence officers who target Ukraine now on behalf of the FSB. They are really focused internally, and they're just doing a ton of activity. And then on a broader global scale, we see actors like APT29 continue to carry out intelligence collection. They want to know what everybody's thinking, right? So when they were trying to decide whether or not to actually invade, they're pulling this intelligence from ministries of foreign affairs all over the world so they can make a better decision. And then there's been the cyber attacks, right? So I think that's what a lot of people see or recognize. And those began before the invasion. A lot of information operations, things like defacements, DDoS. Since the invasion began, we still see quite a bit of it. Some of it's fairly low level comparison to what we know Russia's capable of. We see a lot of destructive attacks that sometimes look like fake ransomware attacks. A lot of them are being accredited to hacktivist organizations that we don't actually believe are hacktivist organizations. We believe they are actually the intelligence services, Russia's intelligence services. Then we see a ton of information operations. And then, of course, on top of all that, there's this layer of intelligence collection that is going on globally. What we haven't seen, we haven't seen as much of that we really anticipated were major attacks that occurred outside of Ukraine, and we're still sort of looking for signs of that, and whether or not those will unfold. But I think that the war is constantly changing. That Russia's doubling down, and there's a lot of things that we're not going to see. It's important to remember that these are spies, and we don't see everything they do. And I think there's some good news. I think that the defenders are doing an exceptional job. Yeah. And I know for certain that many operations have failed because of great defense. And I think I think that's good news.
The Ukrainian defense has really been impressive, and I think it's surprised a lot of people, both physically and on the cyber front. Adam and Katie, do you want to weigh in on this, kind of the pace of activity or what has happened so far?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me is what John noted about what we haven't seen. John, I remember we chatted on a live stream a month into the conflict, and Mandiant put out some awesome guidance on how to prepare for destructive attacks. And I think DHS CISA said shields up. And I'm kind of curious from our perspective. My sense is that perhaps we as defenders misjudged what Russian actors would do, right? Our cognitive biases, we all think that we're going to get targeted, and maybe, I think what we've seen is it's been more regionally based. And, I know early on, we weren't seeing US critical infrastructure hit. Maybe after the US issues sanctions, Russia will retaliate. And I don't think we've really seen that yet. So I guess I'm curious, Adam, if you have thoughts on this as well, why haven't we seen that? Did we underestimate the Russians, or do we overestimate them? My feeling is we might have overestimated a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's not so much that they can't do it. I think that they probably became very quickly embroiled in what was going on in Ukraine, realized that they were over their skis as it pertained to the physical conflict. And they probably marshaled all cyber resources at that point to go hard against Ukraine. We've seen something like, and John, maybe a more up-to-date number, I think it was like 9 different wiper families by 6 or 7 different threat actors operating in the Ukraine. They've been kind of engaged in other places, Moldova, and I think looking at Poland as well. And so, from my perspective, I think looking at their defense budget, because they just announced it a couple of days ago, or a couple of weeks ago now, but $115 billion, I think, going towards their defense budget, which is classified, and I think that will encapsulate cyber programs as well. So I think that this is a marathon, not a sprint, and we need to stay vigilant on that.
Great perspective. I'd argue your shields should never be down, right?
Yeah.
Shield up forever,
I don't think
always.
it's time to put the shields down yet, too.
Yeah.
I think They are essentially doubling down in the physical space. Obviously, I think there was this feeling of momentum, a month ago, and I really thought Russia was going to, slow down, but instead they've doubled down with a lot of their operations, and they may rethink some of the ways that they're carrying things out. And I think, Adam, you raised a good point about the need to support the physical war, right? And these are military resources. Sandworm, for instance, who carries out military, or is a member of the GRU, and they've got the GRU's number one responsibility is to support the war effort. And I think they have to ask questions sometimes of whether or not a destructive attack, which is very visible to all of us, is as important as gathering intelligence to support the warfighter. And I think in most cases it's going to be gathering intelligence.
Well, but you raised Sandworm, and I think that there's a good point there, that if you look at what's been happening over the last week, they've been targeting electrical infrastructure in Ukraine. They're trying to freeze them out, I think, going into the winter. And as we know, they have previously targeted the electrical infrastructure in Ukraine with cyber attacks, Sandworm has. So, I think that it would make sense that they would bring that capability to bear if they're really trying to shut down the grid in Ukraine using both kinetic weapons as well as cyber.
I think that has to be something that Ukraine is concerned about, as well as the U.S. government, right? There has been a proven track record of Russian threat actors being able to disable the electric grid in Ukraine. With temperatures dropping so low going into the winter, this might be the time when we see it. Although obviously there had been an expectation at the beginning of the conflict that we would see that type of attack, and we didn't. And I think there was a little bit of confusion. One kind of piece of analysis that I had heard that was very helpful from a senior official in government was that the degree to which the Russian military was not necessarily prepared for this conflict, that extends also to their cyber operations and their some of their intelligence cyber operations as well. It's true that many people in the Russian government necessarily weren't on the same page when the conflict started. And cyber operations, as we all know, takes a long time to stage. Yeah. They're not easy to do. They burn resources. So that might be why we didn't see as much activity in the beginning, and we still could see a lot of it now.
Well, there were reports, though, of Destroyer 2 showing up, right?
That's right. So Destroyer 2 showed up at one of the Oblanergos, one of the sort of electrical regions. So there was an attack. It was a distinct attack against the sorts of resources. It was disrupted. It appeared. I think the information's not exactly clear what came out publicly, but it looked like it had been disrupted, which again shows the effect that defense is having, which is amazing. And it may have been a hasty incident, right? They may have been trying to basically replay the greatest hits.
Get the band back together.
Exactly. Which might, by the way, put them at risk of that defensive ability to intervene.
Well, and the other thing is that the Ukrainians have been doing a fantastic job of controlling the information flow and the narrative, so it might have been more impactful than we know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's important to remember. A lot of these incidents are about the information flow, right? About scaring people or convincing them that they're not safe. And one of the ways you fight that is simply not let those incidents grow the way that Russia would want them to.
And I think to Adam's point, right, this isn't over. If we look at Ukraine 2015, 2016, those power outages were in December.
Yep.
And so what better way to create fear than have a power outage as those temperatures drop and then ruin holidays for all the defenders as well.
Moving to another threat actor in Iran, Mandiant recently had some analysis on Iranian attacks in Albania. And this was kind of a very important event, a little bit random probably to hear about it, but it was an event that really brought out a strong reaction from the U.S. government and from many allied countries about what happened there. John, what did happen there? Why was Iran targeting Albania? What was going on?
Well, Albania basically plays host to a group called MEK, which is essentially Iran would call those, a dissident group. I think Iran calls them terrorists. And it's been a source of sort of animosity between Iran and Albania for quite a long time. What essentially happened was there was a destructive attack against the Albanian government or Albanian government systems. Not sort of a superficial incident, because there are all these government services that were essentially taken down. So this was an attack against critical infrastructure, right? And it was visible. It was globally visible, and it was taken credit for by sort of a fake or a very very questionable group of people who claimed that they were actually Albanian and they were upset about the presence of MEK within the country. And what was really interesting, they put a predatory sparrow
emblem, yeah.
Emblem in their graphics, and Iran has been recently attacked by a third party. Some guess it may be Israel or the West, or nobody really has a good attribution on them. But that adversary calls himself predatory sparrow, so sort of like a little love note that kind of suggested that it might be Iran.
Yeah, this was really like an extraordinary incident in the sense that it was a destructive attack on a country. The way it kind of came out publicly was a handle on Twitter that was masquerading kind of as a hacktivist group, claiming that it had come from another country. And we're seeing kind of more of this too, these kind of weird anonymous personas coming out and taking credit for nation-state cyber operations, and it's that information component of it that we keep seeing. But in addition to the actual event itself, there was a really strong response. Maybe Adam, you can kind of talk a little bit about that. What happened after the attack actually occurred?
Yeah, I think that obviously the U.S. came out and made some pretty strong statements, but what was also interesting is Albania is a NATO country, and so there's been some discussion around what are the implications of cyber attacks and disruptive attacks as it pertains to Article 5. Which would be the Mutual Defense Clause. And I think that was an interesting discussion that followed on as well. And the Albanian government suspended all diplomatic relations with Iran as a result of this as well. So that was, probably the strongest, I think, that I've ever seen.
The biggest response I've ever seen to a cyber attack.
Yeah. And so, and this group, we've tracked them back to 2008. They've specifically focused on MEK. They've got a variety of wipers that they've brought to bear over the years, and I think that this is showing. And again, with the protests going on in Iran right now, I think it's similar, Katie, to what we were saying about Ukraine and Russia. Once there's domestic uprising or domestic unsettlement, that the government kind of circles the wagons, so to speak. And so I think that, their concern as it pertains to these threats, MEK represents something that could potentially disrupt and impact the regime in Iran. And so I think that their focus now is on stymieing any influence of MEK within the country. And they're looking to, really stop these protests because they're getting, from the Iranian government's perspective, I think they're getting out of control.
And Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think kind of the genesis of this all was that there was this MEK group, essentially an Iranian opposition group, and they were just hosting a conference in Albania. And the fact that they were hosting a conference led to a giant nation-state attack that wiped out government data.
Yeah, I think that's right. But there's also, MEK has been operating out of Albania for years as well, because its proximity to Iran is pretty good. And that's not to say, and I think for everybody in this room, it's important to note that MEK isn't only in Albania, right? There's all across Western Europe. There's Iranian dissident groups here in the U.S. And as we've seen from Iran in general, there's been disruptive attacks. There's been what we've been tracking as lock and leak, where they come in and they've been targeting Israel and North America.
Of course.
They're deploying disingenuous ransomware to lock up the systems, and then they're leaking sensitive information, which is all part of a kind of complex information operation meant to delegitimize the target and to kind of cause people to question the reliability of that entity or that government to protect them. And we've seen, some of these groups that are associated with Iran turning on the air raid sirens in Tel Aviv over the summer and then claiming credit for it as well. So I think, what we've seen over the last, and going back to like 2012 when we first really started becoming aware of Iranian threat actors, is that they've matured. And for me, I think that's the most interesting part, right? in 2012 in
Have
August.
they gotten better? I mean,
What's that?
Have they actually become more sophisticated, more capable?
So this is the interesting thing. It's not about the technical sophistication, it's how they do it, right? So if you think about in August of 2012, they deployed Shamoon against one target in Saudi Arabia to create a massive disruptive wiper attack. In 2015, 2016, 2017, they came back. They used the same tool. In fact, this tool was so bad that that there was a third-party driver with a license key that they were using to get raw disk access to actually overwrite the hard drive. And that had a 2-week license because they used the trial license. They didn't pay for the full license, right? They got the free one. And in 2015, 2016, 2017, when they started reusing Shamoon, they had to change the system date back to 2012 so that the license was still valid to access the hard drive.
I mean, who amongst us is not signed up for the trial, right?
Yeah, look, it works, right?
It works, right? Yeah.
But here's the point. The technology didn't change, and I think we in the cyber field tend to think about sophistication in terms of technical complexity. What changed was how they used it. Instead of going after one target and kind of detonating it like a truck bomb, they went and they started using it almost like the Russians, what they were doing in Ukraine, just constant driving and constantly deploying that ransomware. And so I think they learned a lot, not just the technical capability, because it clearly didn't change, but how to use it and how to use it more effectively to achieve their goal.
Tradecraft is improving.
When we found Newscaster, back in Eyesight Partners Day, this was, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
I had to get into a number of heated discussions about whether or not this could be the Iranian government, because people were looking at the technical artifacts, just refused to believe that this was, the work of a government.
They were just like, this is so bad.
But when you looked at the social engineering, they really separated themselves from everybody else, and they still do that, right?
Yeah.
They are exceptional social engineering. They're very brash and creative in that space. They're patient.
It might have been Kevin Mandiant that back in, I think, 2010 or something like that, said that they're only as advanced, right? Advanced persistent threat is only as advanced as they need to be. And I think we, me certainly being a huge nerd, always kind of had this tendency to over-focus on the technical, over-index on the technical component of it, right?
That's exactly what I was going to say, Adam, is that, right, we have this idea of advanced being advanced tooling, but I think you made a great point that advanced in social engineering and how they deploy it. And the kind of good news, right, we're up here talking about like scary destructive attacks, is that like many intrusions, a lot of the tactics, techniques, and procedures were the same ones you see across intrusions, right? Reading the great work Mandiant put out, that blog post, go check it out. These are things that defenders can actually identify. And so, from my perspective, I think that what happened during that attack was interesting, but we've seen hacktivist groups before, we've seen destructive. I think the real takeaway for those who haven't tracked this carefully is the diplomatic responses, right? Those cutting of ties and the fact that the US came out so quickly with attribution. We were talking about, has the US government ever come out so quickly attributing that to Iranian intelligence services? And, maybe back in the Sony North Korea attack, but that was pretty interesting. And then if you read the Treasury sanctions document, also interesting, right, that the US issued sanctions against a country for an attack on a NATO ally. And I think that's something that doesn't happen every day, right? Not super common. And so I think I'll be looking for, is this a precedent for the US in the future? If you read that sanctions write-up, right, they talk about escalating Iranian cyber aggression. And so I think this was sort of the result of an escalation by Iran, and the US wanted to send a message, but is the precedent that then for any destructive attack on a NATO ally, is the US going to issue sanctions? That could be a lot of work. So it'd be interesting to see if that's a precedent setter or if there is a change in norms there.
It's a great question, a great point.
What I'd also, sorry, Chris, I'm just hijacking this thing.
No, jump in.
We all have thoughts.
Yeah, this is the problem with the threat intel panel, is we're going to
we'll never shut up.
Yeah, but to your point, I think deniability is a huge factor here. And if you go back to like the Sony hack in 2014 with the Guardians of Peace, right? Like these hacktivist groups, these hacktivist groups, these fronts that have been used by nation states in the past, they're starting to go away, and now we're seeing more e-crime show up as like a deniable front. So it's kind of, I think that we as an industry need to be really well prepared for that, because that deniability is the thing that's going to make us work even harder.
We really have a unique opportunity today talking with these experts, because between Red Canary, CrowdStrike, Mandiant, their technology is so widely deployed, they really do see all these important geopolitical events that are happening globally. And one such important event is coming up very soon. It's the US midterm election. Last two topics we've talked about is an increasingly kind of aggressive Russia in the context of Ukraine, using data wipers, potential critical infrastructure attacks, information operations. Iran is active in this space all this year, not like a long time ago. And we're coming into the midterms. Historically, Russia and Iran have been two of the most aggressive in targeting the US election. Predictions, thoughts? I mean, John, what do you think we're actually going to see? Is perhaps the domestic disturbance in Iran and then Russia's struggles in Ukraine going to change anything? Or?
So, I think historically we've seen less on the non-presidential election thing, or less activity. I do think we will see activity, though. I think it's important enough that we're going to see these other actors get involved in some. They already are getting involved with regards to some of the IO stuff. It's not just, it's not just Russia and Iran anymore. China's a player as well. They're probably not as practiced, and some of the cyber stuff that we've seen from some of them aren't as, we haven't seen as complex sort of activity as we've seen historically from Russia or Iran, who've just really been, going hard with IO for a long time. But I expect them to try to catch up. The thing that really worries me is not so much, as somebody who consistently tracks the adversary, it's not the adversary that worries me, it's the environment, right?
Of course.
I think, our country is in an especially poor situation right now to handle something like this. Disinformation or disinformation from an adversary has a better I think opportunity to take seed right now, and I think that it's something that we have to be really concerned. Because of that, we have to be more concerned probably now than ever as a result, even despite whatever the adversary is doing.
Yeah, John, I think I'm more concerned about the U.S. population's response, and that's why I think some of the work from DHS CISA, right? Generally speaking, tomorrow they put out an alert, I want to say 2 weeks ago, saying, right, no evidence that there is any impact on voting itself. And we talk a lot about asymmetric warfare and how, right, adversaries have the advantage. I think they really have the advantage here, because even if they're occupied with cyber operations in their own countries, it's not that tough to take down a local Board of Elections website. And then, bam, the media runs with that. Everyone freaks out. Russia, China, Iran trying to interfere in the US election, when all they really had to do was maybe a denial of service attack on a local election website. And that effect is really outsized from the effort they put in. So that's really what I'm most concerned about, agreeing with you, John.
The airport situation, I think, was a good example of that, right? So this is a superficial incident that really doesn't affect operations.
How often do you visit airport websites?
Yeah, no.
You need a good place to eat? I don't know.
But it's the kind of thing that people notice. That's the wonderful thing about DDoS, right? Or defacements, for that matter, right? These are simple attacks that people will notice and can have some kind of effect as a result.
Well, listen, you need to know where the restaurants are in the airport. So I'm not saying I don't go.
So you're pro airport website.
But I think to your point, you just have to have the inkling of a question: did the election get impacted? In order to spin everybody, not just the media, not just the American public, but the politicians as well, right? Question the legitimacy of voting machines in Michigan, and that turns into a whole narrative,
a 4-year problem, right?
Exactly, and frankly, I think we opened Pandora's box, or let's say the Russians opened Pandora's box back with Kuchev 2.0, because the American public is finding these things now without foreign interference, right? Like, we don't even need the Russians or the Iranians or the Chinese or whoever to get involved. And this isn't just an American problem. we're seeing this across the globe. There was a really interesting incident with the presidential election in Colombia recently, where one of the candidates who was probably going to win, they photoshopped a picture of him with Pablo Escobar and published it like, look, these guys were buddies. And it was totally fictitious, and you could look at both pictures and be like, clearly this was shopped. But it gets to the point that we're seeing elections being assaulted across the globe, and this is a fundamental, existential battle that we need to be winning. That way, the elections need to be fair and secure and guaranteed that way, or we're going to have a huge problem.
The idea of suggesting that something is wrong is really powerful. When I think about 2016, we talk about Fancy Bear, 28, and what they were doing. Sandworm was also, in play, and they were doing things like screwing around, trying to get in their hands in some election-related systems. But I don't.
29 too.
Yeah, in 29. But I don't think they were going to change any outcomes, right? That wasn't the game. Just by targeting those systems, though, they don't need to. They create doubt in the system. It's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
That blew my mind, because when we were working with the DNC back in 2016, we put out this blog post at their request about what we found, and in my mind, back in 2008, there were all these media articles about how China had hacked the McCain campaign and hacked the Obama campaign. And that was espionage, right? They were trying to understand what are their talking points going to be, vis-a-vis Taiwan or whatever it might be. And so when we put that blog post out, we were like, we got them, we got that blog post out. And like less than 24 hours, that euphemism, that euphoria went off a cliff, and Guccifer 2.0 showed up, and we were like, what is going on? And they had, you probably remember, like there was like, what was the KGB name that was in the week docket?
Yeah.
It was
Felix.
Felix, yeah. It was like that changed elections. That was, I think, June 2016. It fundamentally changed elections forever.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's going to be good old-fashioned, normal intelligence collection going on against the elections, right? And now it takes on this whole other flavor. Like there's always been intelligence collection against the political parties. I think the FBI put out something recently about that. It's actually standard, right? If you want to know, if you're an intelligence agency and your job is to know what's going to the future of future of American policy is, you're going to have to start with the politicians who formulate that policy. And they're all figuring it out over emails, and things like that, or who they hire or what think tanks they work with. And you want to get your hands on that information. So it's an absolutely normal part of intelligence collection.
And given Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, and there was another Codell that went to Taiwan a few weeks later, that shows the importance for China, for example, of understanding everybody that's going to be elected in the next cycle, what their position is going to be on Taiwan, because they need to counter that narrative, because they're playing a long game. They're looking at 2049 as their long game of becoming a regional and ultimately global hegemon, and they want to have every piece of data that they can to do something. What
worries me, and this is a good, interesting thing that came out of the Iran thing that we just talked about, the Albania situation, is where it looked to be, they've been in that government for a long time, right? And my question was it an intelligence operation that somebody decided to flip the switch on one day? I worry sometimes that these regular intelligence operations that are, just designed to quietly collect intelligence, they just decide to flip the switch one day because they see an opportunity.
And I think, bringing that more broadly to how U.S. government and others should respond, I think that the traditional espionage side, there's sort of an understanding like everyone's going to spy on everyone. We got it. And so it'll be interesting to see in the next couple election cycles, right, how the U.S. government responds. And right, I anticipate the espionage piece, okay, right, each campaign just needs to be prepared for that. But when there's the disinformation, right, attempting to influence voters, I think that's where we'll start to see more action, maybe more from DHS and the U.S. government.
These events really, they almost, at times, they don't even need to be that well organized or presented. What we saw, for example, in the last election was very strange, I think it's fair to call, video that appeared on Twitter, which we now know came out from Iranian intelligence. with like a rock song,
Metallica.
with a Metallica song in the background,
Yeah.
and it showed them like, just scrolling through kind of like, I think just the front end of an election system.
Yeah, I mean,
and they claimed,
Adam and I were on the phone about the helmets immediately.
Yeah, John and I, like, as soon as we lit up the red line, and as soon as that happened, but they left an IP address in there, which was the whole way that unraveled. But I think what they were trying to do is demonstrate that there was one, to Katie's point about the one website, they got into one state website, they dropped the database, and then 99% of the American public probably didn't understand if they saw that video what they were seeing.
Exactly.
But it was cybery, right? Like they were in a command line, they were playing with SQL tables, they copy and pasted it, and then they got an election ballot, registered for this account. But like, you don't vote online using a website.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I thought it was like, it's a good example of the Iran problem. Like, it's not, there's no Jedi magic technical trick that's going on here, but man, the production values were really good.
Yeah, pretty
That
good.
was professional.
I was blown away.
Like the Metallica.
Yeah.
I wonder if Metallica saw that and they were like, did they pay for that? No, I think it's a really, and it's interesting. We've kind of touched on this topic a few times now, but it's strange how media literacy and the ability to kind of read these stories and understand them is really meshing with these cyber operations. Like, just the ability for the public to understand what's going on, even if the press covers something very responsibly and in a tailored, measured way. It's hard to understand how people are actually going to read into it, and what they're going to. Are they going to understand the difference between targeted and hacked? Are they going to understand the difference between a compromise, an intrusion, an information operation? So
It's up to us to educate, right?
Yeah.
Like, yes, people will panic, but I think reporters who do responsible reporting like you, people are going to understand if you explain this is destructive versus leaking information, right? Not everyone, but I think it's worth a try, right? And I think it's on all of us, everyone in this room, right? Everyone listening, to be part of that educational effort, because I think enough people will understand if we make an effort.
absolutely.
And this is why I think cyber norms is something that I'm not a huge fan of, because, this, to John's point, right, the production quality, and we've seen this with the Russians linking up, news stories that are coming out of the Russian news service, TASS, whatever, and trying to link that up to cyber intrusions or attacks of that nature, right? Like this is all tied together. Yeah. And so cyber isn't just its own thing. It's a component of information warfare. It's a component of electronic warfare. It's a component of strategy and tactics and, military espionage. So we really need to, I think, understand that this is I think the way the Pentagon sees it as a fifth domain of warfare. Right, we need to understand that it can be used for espionage and it can be used for disruptive attack. And to your point, you can flip the switch. Yeah. Right? All of a sudden, this intrusion is no longer about intel collection. Now, let's blow something up.
I think we've covered so much already, and it's kind of almost not right that we leave this to the end with only 7 minutes. But we will touch on ransomware. Because it is such a big concern for businesses throughout the United States, government agencies, et cetera. And it does feel, at least for me in the press, someone who watches this very closely, that we've kind of hit like a little bit of a watershed moment. And maybe that was the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident. I actually had my parents calling me and asking me when they could get gas, and I was like, Mom, I have no idea. And so the public, for I think the first time, really understood what a ransomware incident can do to their lives. And that changed policy. It changed how Washington talked about it. Do you all see it the same way? Do you think Colonial was a watershed moment? Have you seen a reaction?
Depends on how you defined watershed, right? And classic Intel analyst answer, it depends. I do think it was a watershed moment for the US government. And I think, as you noted, post-Colonial Pipeline, I think there was sort of a wake-up call, and as well as public pressure of the everyday impacts that ransomware attacks can have. That said, I don't think it was a watershed moment for the cyber defense community, right? We all knew ransomware was bad. I personally feel like my watershed, or for a lot of other defenders was October 2020, when a bunch of hospitals in the US and Canada got hit by ransomware attacks, height of the pandemic. And I was actually a little surprised that there wasn't a stronger response then. So I think it depends on what your watershed is. And I do think what we've seen post-colonial is, right, the US government turning up the heat. And I think that has changed the ecosystem. I'm glad we're talking about this because I think it's really important. Ransomware, I think, remains one of the greatest threats to every organization. It is not gone. The challenge of ransomware, of course, is that no one knows how bad it really is because no one has visibility. None of our companies see all of the ransomware intrusions, DHS, NSA, no one in the world. And so you'll often hear this, well, ransomware is gone or it's gotten better. It's tough to say. I think it is safe to say, though, that it's changed. Right? Post-colonial and the US government turning up that pressure, we've seen a lot of actors starting to be cognizant of what name they're operating under, like Conti. And we see, this was something that happened before colonial as well, but increasingly actors will say, cool, Conti, that name, US government is clearly, interested in us. Well, let's just split off into different groups and let's change our names. So maybe they won't come after us. So I think we've definitely seen a big change in the last year or so since colonial, as well as the adversaries changing. I think visibility has changed, and this is something a lot of people don't talk about. All right, I mentioned that no one has perfect ransomware visibility, and I think it's important to note that a lot of cyber insurance policies are changing now, not covering ransomware attacks. So read your policy carefully if you have one. And as a result, a lot of folks in our community were not brought in for incident response. And so that has sort of contributed to the fact that there's this idea, well, ransomware is gone because on the defensive side, some of us don't see as many intrusions because we're not being brought in. And so I think it's so important to just share the fact ransomware is still active. And I would argue that for many US organizations, it's probably a greater threat than Russia or Iran.
Of course.
I'm going to have a contrary...
Excellent. Let's throw some chairs here.
Yeah, let's mix it up. I actually think ransomware is, from a profitability perspective, going down.
Fair.
And we're seeing more threat actors moving into data extortion.
Yeah.
And if you think about a ransomware negotiation, the way that typically plays out is you want to drag out that negotiation. So 25 Bitcoin, or you never see your files unlocked again. And then it's like, well, what's Bitcoin? Or I'm not authorized. That guy's on vacation.
The victim wants to draw it out. You're saying.
Yeah. So it's like the hostage situation in I don't know, like a movie, right? Where they just drag it out and try to grind them down on price, grind them down, and get them to make a mistake. And the threat actors don't like that. They don't want you to grind them down and to waste their time. And you can see that in their response. They're like, if you work with this, if you work with Mandiant or you work with whoever, then we're not gonna give you your files back. And so what we're seeing now is it's evolving, and they're doing more data extortion. They're stealing data, they're exfiltrating it out, and then they're leaking it if you don't pay them. And I think that the legal and regulatory and compliance laws that are being passed right now are driving that. Because if you think about, if you lose customer data, if it's healthcare or if it's whoever it might be, you lose that customer data and it gets leaked, there's going to be a lawsuit. There's going to be California Privacy Act, and every state in the union is going to implement its own Privacy Act. And I think what you're going to see is that what's Bitcoin or I'm not authorized turns into well, okay, we're going to leak 10 gigs of your most sensitive data right now, and let's see if you figure out what Bitcoin is real quick, right? So I think that we're seeing that move, and we're even seeing that they're indexing the stolen data to make it easier to find things that are interesting for journalists and for lawyers to...
We've seen them reaching out to journalists and lawyers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Adam, I actually agree with you. I think that under the umbrella of ransomware, right, we kind of historically think of encrypting, but of course now double extortion, encrypting and exfiltrating, and we're increasingly seeing intrusions where it's just exfiltrating. Yeah. And that's my concern, and I agree with you. I think that's sort of where ransomware is going to go in the future.
And so
decrypting's annoying, right?
Yeah, and I think the takeaway is that identity is the critical component, the thing that you need to stop, right? We used to say trust but verify, and the new model is verify, then trust.
Yep.
John, final point, ransomware? Small topic?
It's extortion now. It's cyber extortion. What changed the game was that suddenly cryptocurrency made it possible for you to ask somebody to give you money to you directly, right?
Yeah.
You didn't have to steal financial information and then go through a complex process of monetizing that. So that means all I have to do is find some way to put leverage on you until you give me crypto.
Right.
And that's going to be all kinds of new flavors of it. It's never going to stop.
Never going to stop. I think that's a good place to end the conversation today. I'd like to thank our amazing panel,